Keyword intro reveal Stargate. In the summer of 1973, in a single-story laboratory building on the edge of the campus of Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, a man named Pat Price sat down across from a physicist, accepted a slip of paper bearing nothing but a pair of geographic coordinates, and was asked to describe whatever it was that the coordinates pointed to. Price was a former Burbank police commissioner. He had never been to the Soviet Union. He had not been told what the coordinates referred to. He had not been told what country they referred to. He closed his eyes for several minutes. Then he opened them and began to talk. He described a fenced compound. He described a large overhead crane on rails. He described an underground level. He described, in the kind of awkward detail that someone produces when they are trying to describe a shape they have never seen before, the silhouette of a heavy Soviet armored vehicle in what appeared to be a testing bay. The coordinates referred to the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. The physicists running the session, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, sent Price's description to a contact inside the Central Intelligence Agency. 3 weeks later, a satellite pass over Semipalatinsk produced overhead imagery. The fence was there, the crane was there, the bay was there. Price's drawing of the building plan was off, but it was off in a way that intelligence analysts would later describe as uncomfortably close. What followed that afternoon at Stanford Research Institute became, over the next 17 years, the longest-running paranormal research program ever funded by a Western government. The Army called it Grill Flame. The Defense Intelligence Agency called it Center Lane. The CIA, in the end, called it Stargate. By the early 1970s, the United States intelligence community had developed a specific and persistent anxiety. The anxiety was not about Soviet missiles. It was about Soviet research papers. Since the late 1960s, declassified reports from the Defense Intelligence Agency had begun to flag a growing volume of Soviet open literature work on what the Russians called psychotronics, the study of consciousness, telepathy, and what Western parapsychologists would call psi. A 1972 DIA report, Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR estimated that the Soviet Union was spending the ruble equivalent of roughly $20 million a year on paranormal research, distributed across at least 20 institutes. The report's conclusions were guarded. It did not claim the Soviets had succeeded in anything. It claimed simply that the Soviets were trying, and that if they succeeded, the United States would have no defense and no warning. That was the briefing slide that mattered. In the logic of intelligence, the possibility of a gap is itself a gap. In December of 1972, the CIA's Office of Technical Service quietly authorized a parallel research contract. The contractor was Stanford Research Institute. The principal investigators were two laser physicists with security clearances and an interest in consciousness research, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. What Targ and Puthoff had proposed was not telepathy in the parlor trick sense. They called it remote viewing. The method, codified across the program's first 3 years, was procedural in a way that the early 20th century spiritualists would have found unrecognizable. A viewer was given a sealed envelope, or a set of coordinates, or, later, a randomly selected target number from a pool of pre-prepared photographs. The viewer described and sketched whatever impressions arrived. A monitor was present, but the monitor was kept blind to the target. The session was recorded. The transcripts and sketches were then evaluated by an independent judge against the actual target, scored on a ranked match basis. The method was, on paper, an attempt to do parapsychology the way a physics lab does. Physics, lab does. Physics were artists, engineers, and a handful of self-identified psychics recruited through New York consciousness research circles. Two of them mattered. Ingo Swann was a New York painter. He had walked into Stanford Research Institute in 1972 on his own initiative, looking for a laboratory that would test what he believed he could do. He could, by his own account and in transcripts since released, describe distant locations in some detail when handed nothing but a latitude and longitude. Pat Price came to the laboratory in 1973. He had served as a police commissioner in Burbank in the 1960s and claimed, privately, to have used the same faculty to locate suspects during his career. The two men became the program's two best performers. They also became, within the CIA contract file, its two most carefully measured. The program's eventual case file ran to thousands of sessions. Three are usually cited. In 1974, Pat Price was given the coordinates of a site in the Soviet Semipalatinsk region. The site was, at that point, a facility the CIA had partial overhead coverage of and almost no human intelligence about. Price's transcript described a gantry crane on rails over a buried test bay and the partial silhouette of what he called a very heavy tank, like the new T-72. Subsequent satellite reconnaissance confirmed the gantry in the bay. The vehicle was never publicly identified. The Price transcript remains in the declassified file. In 1979, during the Iranian hostage crisis, the program, by then transferred to the Army and operating under the codename Grill Flame, was tasked with describing the locations and conditions of the American hostages held in Tehran. Over a period of months, viewers produced dozens of sessions. The internal evaluation, declassified in the late 1990s, described the results as of unclear operational value. Some sessions matched details later confirmed, others did not. The Army's own assessment concluded the program had not, in the strict sense, located anyone. In the same year, after a Soviet Tu-22 reconnaissance bomber crashed somewhere in Central Africa, a remote viewer named Rosemary Smith was tasked with locating the wreckage. Her sketch, according to the program's own files, narrowed the search area in a way that allowed recovery teams to reach the aircraft. President Carter is recorded in a 1995 interview as having referred to the case approvingly, without naming the program. These were the cases the program's defenders cited. The program's internal critics, of which there were many, had a longer list of sessions that produced nothing usable at all. For 17 years, no single American agency was willing to fully own the program. It moved between them. In 1978, the operational site was transferred to the United States Army's Intelligence and Security Command at Fort Meade, Maryland, under the codename Grill Flame. The remote viewing unit there, never more than a few dozen personnel, conducted sessions against targets nominated by the Army, the Navy, and the DIA. In 1983, the program was redesignated Center Lane. In 1985, it became Soon Streak. In 1991, after the Defense Intelligence Agency consolidated control, it was renamed for the final time Stargate. The total funding across the 17-year arc, as later reconstructed from the program's own ledgers, came to roughly $20 million. The same figure, almost to the dollar, that the 1972 DIA threat assessment had estimated the Soviets were spending each year. Nobody in the chain of command across 4 administrations was willing to be the official who canceled it. Nobody was willing to be the official who endorsed it either. So it persisted, funded but not advertised, classified but not denied, audited but not believed. In 1995, the Central Intelligence Agency, having inherited the program from the Defense Intelligence Agency at the end of the previous year, contracted the American Institutes for Research to conduct a formal evaluation. The evaluators were 2 statisticians, Jessica Utz of the University of California, Davis, and Ray Hyman of the University of Oregon. Utz was sympathetic to parapsychology. Hyman was a long-standing skeptic. They reviewed the program's case files and its statistical record. Their conclusions did not agree on whether psi existed. They did agree on what mattered to the CIA. The program, the final report stated, has not produced intelligence of useful value. The methodologies were sound enough to register a statistically anomalous signal in laboratory conditions. The operational product, the work that had been delivered to actual intelligence customers, was too vague, too inconsistent, and too difficult to corroborate to act on. In November of 1995, the Central Intelligence Agency announced the program's termination. The announcement was, by the agency's standards, unusually public. A press release confirmed Stargate's existence, its closure, and the headline finding of the AIR report. Approximately 12,000 pages of program files were placed over the following years in what the CIA reading room now catalogs as the Stargate collection. Anyone with an internet connection can read them. In 2017, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency announced a program called Targeted Neuroplasticity Training, a research effort to use peripheral nerve stimulation to accelerate the cognitive performance of military personnel. The program was not classified. The papers were peer-reviewed. The funding was approximately $50 million. In 2025, a private American company, Neuralink, implanted a brain-computer interface in its first wave of human patients under an FDA investigational device exemption. The trial was advertised. The Department of Defense, through DARPA's next-generation non-surgical neurotechnology program, was reported to be funding parallel research lines. The technologies are not the same as Stargate. The epistemology is. Each of them asks an intelligence service to act on a signal whose ground truth is hard to confirm independently. Each of them asks an analyst to decide, before the operation, whether the source is real. In the case of remote viewing, the answer arrived after 17 years and $20 million. Not reliably enough. In the case of the technologies that have replaced it, neural interfaces, cognitive enhancement, AI systems generating intelligence assessments from open source data, the answer has not yet arrived. The CIA has not yet contracted the American Institutes for Research to write the final report on those. For 17 years, the United States government funded a program to determine whether a former Burbank police commissioner could see, with his eyes closed, inside a Soviet weapons facility he had never visited. The program's own final evaluation concluded that he could not, in the way that mattered to an intelligence service. It also concluded that something in the laboratory data had not been entirely explained away. The CIA closed the file in 1995. The file is now public. The bureaucracy that funded it has moved on to other questions about consciousness, perception, and the limits of what a state will pay to know. The page they didn't want you to read, in the case of Stargate, was not the page that confirmed it had worked. It was the page that confirmed how long they had been willing to wait to find out.